I'm a huge fan of poetry. I love to read it, I love to study it, and I love to write it. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is how poetry, because of the way that it takes the English language, or any language really, but in my context, the English language, and just masterfully uses it in a way to elevate the soul and mind to things of truth, to things of goodness, to things of beauty especially. I think that every serious Christian should be a consumer of poetry and should be reading poetry in conjunction with whatever else it is that they're currently reading. I recently picked up a copy of Shakespeare's Sonnets and A Lover's Companion, and I have been reading it and devouring some of these sonnets. Sonnet is one of my favorites. Haiku is another one of my favorites to read. And I was reading this and I was thinking about just how Shakespeare in this context is writing about things that are not necessarily Christian, but is masterfully using words that invoke meaning and profound sense of awe and wonder in such a way that when I picked up a theological text that is the opposite of poetry, my ability to appreciate the words being used, my ability to appreciate the theological concepts being conveyed was elevated because I had just read poetry prior. And so, as I've thought about this, I just wanted to make a short video to say the things that we read matter, and the diversity in what we read, I think, does matter. Not that we have to read enormously diverse things, but I do think that we should be reading a multiplicity of genres in order to help us, because I think those genres actually enhance one another in such a way that when we finish reading, we will have realized that all of the things we've read were elevated by the other thing that we read. And I think Scripture itself is written in such a diverse landscape of genres for this purpose. We read poetry in Scripture. We read narrative in Scripture. We read apocalypse in Scripture. We read prophetic texts in Scripture. We read all sorts of different genres, and altogether it has this cohesive, unified continuity with itself, and each story, each narrative, each account comes together and elevates us to the ultimate source of truth, goodness, and beauty. And so, in reading Scripture, I think Scripture's different genres tell us, friends, read widely. Read poetry. Read biographies. Read historical fiction. Read regular fiction. Read nonfiction. Read theological texts. Read doctoral dissertations. Read everything that you can to challenge yourself to move beyond that which you think you know. Challenge yourself to read things that you would not gravitate towards. And then in your reading of that thing, go back and read the thing you really love and see, is there a difference in the way that I appreciate this because of this other reading experience? I think you'll be surprised to find the answer is yes. And I think this is especially true with things like poetry. When I read poetry, I feel light. I feel more grounded in the world as it was meant to be perceived. I feel almost like an infant seeing the world for the first time when I read poetry. And that affects the way that I then go and read other texts. It affects the way I live my life. And so I think the worst mistake that we can make, that I think a lot of us make, especially as more academic-minded, theologian-type personalities, if you're anything like me, is we can get in a rut of just reading the same kind of thing over and over and over and over again. And while we may grow in our intellectual capacity to articulate a particular subject, we're not a very well-rounded person when it comes to our educational formation. I think we need to read a diverse landscape of things because it'll strengthen the readings that we do elsewhere. And I think Scripture tells us that this is the case. I think Scripture's written the way that it is because this is the case, fundamental to the nature of the way that the world works. And so I think it's our duty to embrace this, to accept this, and to take effort to do it. So what I am planning to do is no matter what text I'm reading, I'm always going to have a book of poetry right next to it that I'm going to be reading in conjunction with it. Always. And I think that if I continue to do this, I'm going to see increasing fruit bloom in all my other academic reading. And I think you will too. So that's my recommendation. Take it or leave it. But don't say I didn't warn you.